The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty military training ground in Coronado, California. Sarah Mitchell stood at the entrance gate, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. She clutched a worn piece of paper in her sweaty palm, the acceptance letter that had taken her 3 years to earn. At 24, she was about to become the first woman to attempt the most grueling military training program in the world. Sarah wasn't like other girls her age. While her friends were planning weddings and starting families, she spent her evenings at the gym, pushing her body to limits that made grown men quit. Her muscles were lean but strong, carved from years of relentless training. Her determination came from a promise she made to her younger brother before he died in Afghanistan, a promise that she would serve her country with the same courage he had shown. The Navy SEAL training facility looked like something from a nightmare. Obstacle courses stretched as far as the eye could see. Heavy ropes hung from towering wooden structures. Cold, unforgiving ocean waves crashed against the shore where countless men had pushed their bodies beyond breaking point. This place had broken the spirits of thousands of the strongest, toughest men America had to offer. As Sarah walked through the gates, she noticed the stares. Groups of muscular men in military uniforms stopped their conversations to watch her pass. Some whispered to each other, others shook their heads in disbelief. A few laughed quietly, thinking she was lost or looking for someone else. None of them believed she belonged there. Commander James Rodriguez had been training Navy SEALs for 15 years. He had seen every type of person attempt this program: former college football players, Olympic athletes, martial arts experts, and decorated military veterans. Most of them failed. The success rate was less than 20%, and that was for men who had spent their entire lives preparing for this moment. When Commander Rodriguez received the paperwork about Sarah's acceptance, he nearly threw it in the trash. He had fought against allowing women in the program for years, not because he doubted their intelligence or courage, but because he knew the physical demands would destroy them. The training was designed to push the human body past its natural limits. It wasn't about being fair or equal. It was about creating warriors who could survive impossible situations. Sarah's first day began at 4 in the morning with a wake-up call that sounded like thunder. She jumped out of her narrow bunk bed and quickly dressed in the standard training uniform. Around her, 47 other recruits were doing the same thing. They were all men, all bigger than her, all looking at her like she was about to ruin their chances of becoming SEALs. The first test was a simple fitness evaluation: push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups, and a 4-mile run on the beach. For most people, this would be the hardest workout of their life. For SEAL candidates, it was just the warm-up. Sarah lined up with the others, ignoring the snickers and comments from the men around her. 50 push-ups in 2 minutes, shouted Instructor Peterson, a mountain of a man with scars covering his arms. Anyone who can't make it can pack their bags right now. Sarah dropped to the ground and began her push-ups. Her form was perfect, back straight, arms at 90 degrees, chest touching the ground with each rep, while several men around her struggled and grunted. She moved like a machine. Her breathing was controlled, her movements smooth. When Instructor Peterson called time, Sarah had completed 63 push-ups. The instructor looked at his clipboard, then at Sarah, then back at his clipboard. He had expected her to fail immediately. Instead, she had just outperformed half the men in the class. The sit-ups were next. 2 minutes, minimum of 50 required. Sarah knocked out 78, without breaking a sweat. During the pull-ups, she managed 18 when the minimum was 8. The men around her were starting to pay attention now, but not in a good way. They felt threatened, embarrassed that a woman was keeping up with them. Then came the 4-mile beach run, and this was where everyone expected Sarah to fall behind. Running in soft sand while wearing heavy boots was brutal. It felt like trying to sprint through quicksand. The stronger candidates pulled ahead immediately, their longer legs eating up the distance. Sarah started somewhere in the middle of the pack, keeping a steady pace. She had learned from years of training that the key to distance running wasn't speed, it was consistency. While the men around her surged forward and then slowed down, she maintained the same rhythm mile after mile. By the second mile, several candidates had already dropped out, walking off the beach with their heads hung in shame. By the third mile, even some of the strongest men were struggling, their breathing heavy and labored. Sarah, meanwhile, looked like she could run for another 10 miles. As they approached the finish line, Sarah was in the top 15. She crossed with a time that would have been impressive for any candidate, male or female. But instead of congratulations, she was met with cold stares and whispered complaints. "She's going to get us all killed," muttered one candidate, a former Marine who had barely made the time requirement. "This isn't a game," said another. "When we're in real combat, we can't worry about babysitting." Sarah heard every word, but she kept her face emotionless. She had expected this reaction. What she hadn't expected was how much it would hurt. These men didn't even know her, but they had already decided she didn't belong. That evening, Sarah sat alone in the mess hall, eating her dinner while the other candidates gathered in groups around her. She could feel their eyes on her, judging every move she made. Some were clearly angry that she was there. Others seemed curious but wouldn't approach her because they didn't want to be seen talking to her. The food was basic military fare: overcooked meat, bland vegetables, and bread that could probably be used as a weapon. Sarah ate mechanically, thinking about her brother Danny. He had gone through similar training in the Army Rangers, and she remembered him telling her about the brotherhood that formed between soldiers during intense training. "It's not just about becoming stronger," Danny had said during his last visit home. "It's about learning to trust the person next to you with your life. When everything goes wrong, when you're scared and tired and want to quit, that's when you find out what you're really made of." Sarah missed her brother terribly. He had been her best friend, her biggest supporter, and her inspiration for joining the military. When his unit was ambushed in Afghanistan, he had died trying to save his fellow soldiers. The army gave him medals and called him a hero. But Sarah just wanted her brother back. After dinner, Sarah returned to her barracks to find her bunk had been sabotaged. Someone had short-sheeted her bed, put shaving cream in her pillowcase, and hidden her alarm clock. It was the kind of prank that military units had been playing on new recruits for decades. But Sarah knew it was more than that. It was a message: "You don't belong here." She quietly fixed her bed, cleaned the shaving cream, and found her alarm clock without saying a word. The other recruits watched from their bunks, waiting to see how she would react. Would she complain to the instructors? Would she cry? Would she quit and go home? Instead, Sarah simply prepared for the next day. She laid out her uniform, polished her boots, and reviewed the training schedule. She went to sleep knowing that tomorrow would be even harder than today, and the day after that would be worse still. Commander Rodriguez observed all of this from his office window. He had cameras throughout the facility and had watched Sarah's first day with growing interest. He had expected her to fail spectacularly, to prove his point that women didn't belong in SEAL training. Instead, she had performed better than most of the men and handled the hazing with impressive maturity. But one day meant nothing. SEAL training lasted for months, and each phase was designed to be harder than the last. The instructors would push every candidate beyond their breaking point, and then push them further. They would be deprived of sleep, food, and comfort. They would be forced to work as a team while competing against each other. They would face their deepest fears and darkest moments. Rodriguez had seen Olympic athletes quit after a week. He had watched decorated war veterans break down and cry. The training wasn't just about physical strength. It was about mental toughness, emotional resilience, and the ability to function when everything inside you was screaming to give up. As he watched Sarah through the window, polishing her boots with the same attention to detail that the best SEALs brought to every task, Rodriguez found himself wondering something he had never wondered before. Maybe, just maybe, this woman might be different. The thought bothered him more than he cared to admit. For 15 years, he had built his reputation on being able to predict which candidates would succeed and which would fail. He prided himself on spotting weakness, on knowing exactly how much pressure each person could handle before they broke. But Sarah Mitchell was unlike anyone he had ever trained. She didn't fit into any of his categories or predictions. She was smaller than every other candidate, but she had shown no signs of being intimidated. She was clearly being targeted by the other recruits, but she hadn't let it affect her performance. She was walking into a world where she had no allies and no support, but she seemed determined to succeed anyway. Rodriguez closed the file on his desk and prepared to go home to his family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests, and new opportunities for Sarah to fail. The real training hadn't even started yet. Phase 1 would begin in the morning, and that's when they would see what she was really made of. As the lights went out in the barracks, Sarah lay in her narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling. Around her, she could hear the quiet sounds of 47 men trying to fall asleep. Shifting blankets, muffled coughs, the occasional snore. She felt utterly alone, surrounded by people who wished she would disappear. But loneliness wasn't new to Sarah. She had felt alone since Danny died. Alone since she decided to follow this impossible dream. The difference was that now she was alone with a purpose. Every push-up, every run, every challenge was bringing her closer to honoring her brother's memory and proving that she belonged among America's elite warriors. Tomorrow would bring Hell Week, the most infamous part of SEAL training. For 5 days and nights, candidates would be pushed to their absolute limits with almost no sleep, constant physical challenges, and psychological pressure designed to make them quit. Most candidates who made it through the first day of Hell Week still failed before it was over. Sarah pulled her thin blanket up to her chin and closed her eyes. She thought about Danny, about the promise she had made at his funeral, about all the people who said she couldn't do this. She thought about the record that no woman had ever achieved, completing Navy SEAL training. She had asked if she could try, and they had laughed. Soon, she would show them that their laughter was premature. Hell Week began at midnight on a Sunday with the sound of machine gun fire and explosions. Sarah jolted awake as instructors stormed into the barracks, screaming orders and firing blank ammunition into the air. Smoke filled the room as candidates scrambled out of their bunks, disoriented and confused. This was it, the week that would separate the warriors from everyone else. "Move, move, move," screamed Instructor Davidson, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You have 30 seconds to get outside in full gear, or you're out." Sarah's training kicked in automatically. While other candidates fumbled with their equipment in the dark, she had already memorized the location of every piece of gear. Her hands moved quickly and efficiently, grabbing her helmet, vest, and weapons in the exact order she had practiced hundreds of times. She was the third person out of the barracks, ahead of men who had been preparing for this moment their entire lives. The instructors had transformed the training compound into a war zone. Explosions lit up the night sky. Hoses sprayed freezing water from every direction. Loudspeakers blasted sounds of battle, screaming, gunfire, and chaos that was designed to overwhelm the senses and break down rational thinking. "Welcome to Hell Week," shouted Commander Rodriguez, his voice barely audible over the noise. "For the next 5 days, you will get a maximum of 4 hours of sleep total. You will be cold, wet, tired, and miserable every second. Most of you will quit before sunrise. The smart ones will quit right now." As if on cue, 3 candidates immediately raised their hands and rang the brass bell that sat in the center of the compound. The bell was the symbol of surrender. Ring it 3 times, and you could walk away from the pain and return to a normal life. Sarah watched as the first 3 men of her class gave up without even trying. The remaining candidates were immediately ordered into the frigid Pacific Ocean. The water temperature was 58 degrees, cold enough to cause hypothermia within minutes. Sarah gasped as the icy waves crashed over her body, but she forced herself to stay focused. This was just the beginning. "Link arms," shouted Instructor Peterson. "You will stay in this water until I say otherwise. Anyone who breaks the chain causes everyone to start over." Sarah found herself between 2 large men who clearly didn't want her there. The candidate on her left, a former college wrestler named Mike Torres, made no effort to support her as the waves tried to knock them down. The man on her right, a Marine veteran called Big Jim, actively tried to make things harder by pulling her deeper into the water. The ocean was merciless. Wave after wave crashed over the candidates, filling their mouths with salt water and threatening to separate them from the group. Sarah's teeth chattered uncontrollably, and she could feel her body temperature dropping dangerously low. But she held on, focusing on her breathing and staying connected to the chain of bodies fighting against the ocean. After 20 minutes in the water, 2 more candidates quit. They simply let go of the chain, walked to shore, and rang the bell. Sarah could understand why. The cold was so intense it felt like knives stabbing into every part of her body. Her fingers had gone completely numb, and she could barely feel her legs, but she didn't quit. The next challenge was a series of obstacle courses that had to be completed while soaking wet and shivering. Sarah's smaller size actually helped her here. She could move through tight spaces and climb over barriers more easily than the bigger men. But the rope climbs were brutal. Her hands were so cold she could barely grip the rope, and her wet clothes added extra weight that made every movement exhausting. During one particularly difficult obstacle, Big Jim deliberately stepped on Sarah's hand as she tried to climb over a wall. The pain shot through her arm, but she didn't make a sound. She simply adjusted her grip and continued climbing. She could see the surprise in his eyes. He had expected her to complain or fall. By sunrise, 12 candidates had quit. Sarah was still there, moving through each challenge with mechanical precision. Her body was running on pure determination now. Every muscle screamed in protest. Her lungs burned from the cold air, and her mind was starting to play tricks on her. But she kept moving forward. The instructors noticed her persistence. During a brief water break, Instructor Davidson approached her with a clipboard. "Mitchell," he said, his voice unusually quiet. "You've got nothing to prove here. You've already gone further than anyone expected. There's no shame in ringing the bell." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes red from salt water and exhaustion. "Sir, I'm not here to go further than anyone expected. I'm here to become a Navy SEAL." Davidson studied her face for a long moment. He had given the same speech to hundreds of candidates over the years, usually right before they quit. Most of them took his words as permission to give up, but Sarah's response was different. She wasn't looking for an easy way out. She was stating a fact about her intentions. "Carry on," he said, and walked away. The second day brought the infamous log PT, physical training with telephone poles that weighed over 200 pounds. Teams of 6 candidates had to carry these logs everywhere they went, running on the beach, doing exercises, even eating meals. It was designed to teach teamwork and shared suffering. Sarah was assigned to a team with 5 men who had already decided they didn't want her there. They made no effort to accommodate her shorter height or different body mechanics. When they lifted the log for overhead presses, they held it at a height that forced her to fully extend her arms while they barely bent their elbows. When they ran with the log, they set a pace that was comfortable for their longer legs but brutal for hers. "This is impossible with her on the team," complained Torres during a brief rest. "She's too weak to carry her share of the weight. Maybe if you actually worked with me instead of against me, we'd perform better," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. Big Jim laughed harshly. "Little girl wants to play with the big boys but can't handle the consequences." What happened next surprised everyone, including Sarah herself. Instead of getting angry or defensive, she started analyzing the problem like an engineer. She noticed that their team was performing worse than teams with smaller but more coordinated members. She realized that teamwork wasn't just about raw strength, it was about efficiency, communication, and shared purpose. During the next log carry, Sarah started calling out rhythm and direction commands. "Lift on 3, 2, 1, lift. Shorter steps, stay together. Shift left, big wave coming." Her teammates were annoyed at first, but they couldn't argue with the results. Their team's performance improved dramatically when they started moving as a coordinated unit instead of 6 individuals fighting each other. By the end of the second day, their team was finishing exercises faster than groups with stronger individual members. The instructors noticed, and Sarah could see them making notes on their clipboards. She had found a way to contribute that went beyond pure physical strength. The third day was when the real psychological warfare began. Candidates were deprived of sleep for over 60 hours, fed only cold military rations, and subjected to constant stress. Many began to hallucinate from exhaustion. Some saw family members calling them home. Others imagined they were back in previous military deployments. Sarah's hallucinations were different. She saw Danny, her brother, standing among the instructors during particularly difficult moments. He didn't say anything. He just smiled and nodded, reminding her why she was there. Whether it was real or her exhausted mind playing tricks on her, it gave her strength to continue. During the infamous steel pier exercise, candidates had to lie on their backs on a concrete pier while instructors sprayed them with fire hoses. The combination of concrete, water, and wind created a level of cold that penetrated to the bone. Men who had never quit anything in their lives started ringing the bell rather than endure another minute. Sarah lay on that pier for over an hour. Her body shook so violently, she couldn't control it. Her lips turned blue, and she lost feeling in her extremities. But every time she thought about quitting, she remembered her promise to Danny. She had sworn at his funeral that she would serve her country with the same courage he had shown. Ringing the bell would mean breaking that promise. "Mitchell," shouted Commander Rodriguez. "How are you feeling?" "Cold, sir," she replied through chattering teeth. "Do you want to quit?" "No, sir." "Why not?" "Because my brother died so that others could live, sir. I'm not quitting because I'm uncomfortable." Rodriguez stared at her for a long moment. Around Sarah, other candidates were giving up one by one, walking to the bell and ending their dreams of becoming SEALs. But this small woman, who had no business surviving this kind of punishment, was refusing to break. The fourth day brought beach runs that seemed to last forever. Teams had to carry heavy boats over their heads while running through soft sand. Sarah's team had developed into a well-oiled machine, with each member knowing exactly when to adjust their grip, when to rest, and when to push harder. During one particularly long run, Big Jim collapsed from exhaustion. Without hesitation, Sarah and two other teammates helped him to his feet and supported his weight while continuing to carry the boat. Jim was too tired to protest, and by the time they reached the finish line, something had changed in his attitude toward Sarah. "Why did you help me?" he asked later, genuine confusion in his voice. "I've been making things harder for you since day one." Sarah looked at him with eyes that seemed much older than her 24 years. "Because that's what teammates do. When someone falls, you pick them up. It doesn't matter if they like you or not." That night, as the remaining candidates tried to catch a few precious minutes of sleep, Sarah overheard a conversation that changed everything. Torres was talking to another candidate about a bet they had made. "I give her 2 more hours," Torres was saying. "Nobody that small can handle what's coming tomorrow." "I don't know, man," replied the other candidate. "She's lasted longer than guys twice her size. Maybe she's got something we don't." "It's not about heart or determination," Torres insisted. "Tomorrow is the underwater demolition training. She'll drown, and then we'll all be responsible for carrying her body out of there. Is proving a point worth dying for?" Sarah pretended to sleep, but her mind was racing. She knew Torres was right about one thing. The underwater training was going to be the hardest challenge yet. Candidates would be required to swim long distances underwater, perform complex tasks while holding their breath, and survive simulated drowning scenarios. Her smaller lung capacity and body size would be significant disadvantages, but as she lay there in the darkness, listening to the ocean waves crash against the shore, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. She wasn't going to just survive the underwater training. She was going to excel at it. She was going to show every person who had doubted her that determination could overcome any physical limitation. The 5th and final day of Hell Week dawned gray and cold. Of the 48 candidates who had started, only 19 remained. Sarah was among them, but she looked like a ghost of her former self. She had lost 15 pounds in 5 days. Her face was gaunt from exhaustion, and her eyes were hollow from lack of sleep, but she was still there. The final challenge was the underwater demolition course, a series of tasks that had to be completed while holding your breath in deep, dark water. Candidates had to swim underwater for over 100 meters, untie complex knots while submerged, and simulate placing explosive charges on the hull of a ship. Sarah stood at the edge of the pool, knowing that this was the moment everyone expected her to fail. The water was black and cold, with visibility of only a few feet. The instructors had made it clear that anyone who panicked or failed to complete the course would be immediately removed from the program. She thought about Danny one last time, took the deepest breath of her life, and dove into the water. What happened next would determine whether she became a Navy SEAL or just another person who tried and failed. The underwater world was silent and alien. Sarah moved through the water like a dolphin, her smaller body cutting through the liquid with surprising efficiency. While larger candidates struggled with buoyancy and water resistance, she glided effortlessly toward the first checkpoint. The first task was to untie a series of knots that had been tied underwater. Her lungs were already starting to burn, but Sarah forced herself to stay calm and work methodically. One by one, she loosened the knots, her fingers working with precision despite the cold and pressure. Halfway through the course, she realized something incredible was happening. Not only was she keeping up with the other candidates, she was ahead of most of them. Her smaller oxygen requirements and superior underwater technique were giving her advantages that nobody had anticipated. As Sarah completed the final task and surfaced, gasping for air, she saw something she had never seen before in the faces of the instructors. It wasn't surprise or grudging respect. It was genuine admiration. She had not only survived Hell Week, she had excelled in the one area where everyone expected her to fail. Commander Rodriguez was waiting at the edge of the pool with a stopwatch in his hand. When he saw Sarah's time, he looked at the watch again, certain there had been a mistake. Then he looked at Sarah, this small woman who had just shattered every assumption about what was possible. "Outstanding work, Mitchell," he said quietly. "Outstanding work." As the remaining candidates climbed out of the pool, Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed. The men who had spent 5 days trying to break her were now looking at her differently. She had earned something that couldn't be given or taken away: their respect. But Hell Week was just the beginning. The hardest parts of SEAL training were still ahead, and Sarah knew that some of her biggest challenges had nothing to do with physical strength or endurance. She would need to prove herself in areas where her gender and size offered no advantages, areas where only pure skill and intelligence would determine success or failure. 3 months after Hell Week, Sarah faced her greatest challenge yet, the final evaluation that would determine whether she became the first woman to earn the Navy SEAL Trident. Only 9 candidates remained from the original 48, and each one was pushed to demonstrate mastery of skills that took most people years to develop. The evaluation took place at a classified facility where everything was designed to test real-world combat situations. Sarah and her fellow candidates were divided into teams and given a mission that seemed impossible: infiltrate a heavily defended compound, rescue hostages, and escape without being detected. They had 12 hours to plan and execute the operation. Sarah found herself leading a team of 4 men, including Big Jim and Torres, who had become unlikely allies during the months of training. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same men who had tried to break her during Hell Week were now depending on her leadership to complete the most important mission of their military careers. "All right, listen up," Sarah said as they studied satellite photos of the target compound. "This isn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It's about being smart, patient, and working perfectly as a team." The compound was a fortress: high walls, guard towers, patrols with dogs, and motion sensors covering every approach. Traditional military tactics would require overwhelming force and would likely result in casualties. But SEALs were trained to think differently, to find solutions that nobody else would consider. Sarah spent hours analyzing the intelligence, looking for patterns and weaknesses that others might miss. She noticed that the guards changed shifts at specific times, creating brief windows of vulnerability. She identified blind spots in the security cameras and guard positions. Most importantly, she realized that the facility's strongest defenses were also its greatest weakness. "The front gate has 12 guards. But look at this," she said, pointing to the satellite image. "The garbage collection point is only monitored by 1 camera, and it's outside the main security perimeter. If we can get inside the waste management system, we can access the underground tunnels that lead directly to the building where the hostages are being held." Big Jim looked skeptical. "You want us to crawl through sewage pipes?" "I want us to complete the mission," Sarah replied. "They're expecting us to come over the walls or through the front gate. They're not expecting us to come from below." Torres studied the plan more carefully. "It could work, but the timing has to be perfect. One mistake, and we're all dead or captured." Sarah smiled grimly. "Then we don't make mistakes." The infiltration began at midnight. Sarah's team approached the compound through a drainage ditch that ran along the back of the property. They moved in complete silence, using hand signals to communicate and coordinate their movements. Every step was calculated, every breath controlled. Sarah led the way through the underground tunnels, her smaller size allowing her to navigate tight spaces that would have been impossible for larger team members. The tunnels were dark, cramped, and filled with obstacles, but Sarah moved through them like she had been born underground. When they reached the access point beneath the target building, Sarah's real test began. The hostages were being held in a room on the 3rd floor, guarded by armed personnel who had shoot-to-kill orders. Getting to the hostages would require Sarah to demonstrate every skill she had learned: stealth, marksmanship, hand-to-hand combat, and tactical thinking under extreme pressure. Sarah emerged from the tunnel system into the basement of the building. Using night vision equipment and her knowledge of the building's layout, she began moving through the corridors like a ghost. Every movement was silent, every decision calculated to avoid detection. She encountered her first guard on the 2nd floor. He was a large man, heavily armed and trained in close-quarters combat. In a traditional fight, he would have overpowered Sarah easily. But SEALs weren't trained to fight fair. They were trained to win. Sarah used the environment to her advantage, striking from behind and using pressure points that instantly disabled her opponent without making noise. The guard never knew what hit him. She secured his weapons and continued moving toward the hostages. The hostage room was protected by 3 guards and multiple security measures. Sarah positioned herself in the corridor and waited for the perfect moment. When one guard stepped away to check a suspicious sound, she moved with lightning speed. Her marksmanship training took over. 3 shots, fired in perfect sequence, each one precisely placed to neutralize threats without endangering the hostages. The entire engagement lasted less than 4 seconds. The guards never had a chance to return fire or raise an alarm. Sarah entered the hostage room to find 3 civilians, actually instructors playing their roles in the exercise. They looked at her with surprise, clearly not expecting to see a woman leading their rescue. "Who are you?" one of them asked. "I'm your way out of here," Sarah replied. "Stay close, stay quiet, and do exactly what I tell you." The escape route was even more dangerous than the infiltration. Sarah had to lead 5 people through the compound without being detected, navigate back through the underground tunnels, and reach the extraction point before dawn. Any noise or mistake would trigger alarms and bring dozens of heavily armed guards. But Sarah had planned for contingencies. She had identified multiple escape routes and had positioned her team members at strategic points to provide cover and support when they encountered an unexpected patrol near the tunnel entrance. Big Jim was in position to create a distraction while Sarah led the hostages to safety. As they emerged from the drainage ditch and reached the extraction zone, Sarah checked her watch. They had completed the entire mission in 8 hours to 4 hours ahead of schedule and without triggering a single alarm or losing any team members. Commander Rodriguez was waiting at the extraction point with a team of evaluators. He had been monitoring the mission through surveillance cameras and radio communications, and what he had witnessed fundamentally changed his understanding of what made an effective SEAL. Debriefing in 1 hour, Rodriguez announced to Sarah's team, "Outstanding work, all of you." During the debriefing, each aspect of the mission was analyzed in detail. Sarah's tactical planning, leadership under pressure, and technical execution were evaluated by experts who had decades of experience in special operations. The infiltration route was innovative, noted one evaluator. Most teams chose more direct approaches that would have resulted in detection and mission failure. The hostage rescue was textbook perfect, added another. Precise, efficient, and completely silent. But it was the final comment from Commander Rodriguez that surprised everyone in the room. "In 15 years of evaluating SEAL candidates, I have never seen a mission executed with this level of precision and efficiency." Candidate Mitchell didn't just complete the exercise. She redefined how we think about tactical operations. After the debriefing, Sarah was called into Rodriguez's office alone. She had no idea what to expect. Had she made some mistake that disqualified her? Was there some final test she still had to pass? Rodriguez gestured for her to sit down, then pulled out a thick file from his desk drawer. "I owe you an apology," he said simply. "When you first arrived here, I thought you were a political statement. I thought the Navy was sacrificing training standards to make a point about gender equality. I was wrong." He opened the file and showed Sarah pages of evaluation scores, fitness records, and performance metrics. "These are your scores compared to every SEAL candidate we've trained in the past 5 years. Rodriguez continued. "You didn't just meet the standards, Mitchell. You exceeded them in categories that we've never seen a candidate excel in." Sarah looked at the numbers with growing amazement. Her marksmanship scores were in the top 5% of all candidates. Her tactical planning evaluations were off the charts. Her leadership assessments showed consistent excellence in every category. But it was the final page that took her breath away. "The underwater demolition course," Rodriguez said quietly. "Your time wasn't just a personal best or a class record. You completed that course faster than any candidate in the history of SEAL training, male or female." Sarah stared at the page, hardly believing what she was seeing. The record she had broken had been held for over 8 years by a candidate who was now a decorated Navy SEAL serving in classified operations around the world. "How is that possible?" she whispered. Rodriguez smiled. The first genuine smile she had ever seen from him. "Because you proved that physical strength isn't everything. Your technique, your efficiency, your refusal to panic under pressure. These things matter more than raw power. You swam that course like you were born in the water." He stood up and walked to a cabinet on the far side of his office. When he turned around, he was holding a small velvet box that Sarah immediately recognized. "Sarah Mitchell," Rodriguez said formally. "By the authority vested in me by the United States Navy, I hereby award you the Naval Special Warfare Insignia. You have successfully completed basic underwater demolition, SEAL training, and are now qualified to serve as a Navy SEAL." Sarah's hands shook as she accepted the trident pin that symbolized her achievement. She thought about Danny, about all the people who had said this was impossible, about the months of pain and doubt and determination that had brought her to this moment. "Sir," she said, her voice barely controlled, "I have a question." "What is it, Petty Officer Mitchell?" "You said I broke a record. What happened to the man who held it before me?" Rodriguez's expression became serious. He completed 3 tours in Afghanistan and received the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism. He saved the lives of 18 fellow service members during a mission that went wrong. He's exactly the kind of warrior we hope to create in this program. Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of what she had accomplished. She hadn't just become the first woman to earn the SEAL Trident. She had proven that excellence had no gender. The graduation ceremony took place the following week. Sarah stood with the 8 other candidates who had survived the complete training program, each one now qualified to serve in the most elite military unit in the world. As they received their assignments to SEAL teams around the globe, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had asked if she could try, and they had laughed. They had told her she was too small, too weak, too different to succeed in their world. But Sarah had learned something that her instructors were only beginning to understand. That diversity of thought, approach, and technique could enhance effectiveness rather than diminish it. Her different perspective had led to tactical innovations that impressed seasoned veterans. Her determination had inspired teammates who had initially resented her presence. Most importantly, she had proven that the standards that mattered most in special operations, courage, intelligence, adaptability, and commitment to teammates, had nothing to do with gender or physical size. 3 months later, Sarah received her first deployment orders. She would be assigned to a SEAL team conducting classified operations in a region where her skills would be particularly valuable. Her commanders had specifically requested her because of her demonstrated excellence in underwater operations and tactical planning. As she prepared to leave for her first mission, Sarah visited Danny's grave one last time. She placed her hand on the headstone and spoke quietly to her brother. "I kept my promise, Danny. I served with the same courage you showed, and I learned something you tried to teach me, that being a warrior isn't about being the biggest or the strongest. It's about refusing to quit when everything tells you to give up." The wind rustled through the trees around the cemetery, and for a moment, Sarah could almost hear her brother's voice telling her how proud he was. Sarah Mitchell had asked if she could try when everyone laughed at her dreams. She had endured months of the most brutal training in the world. She had earned the respect of men who had initially wanted her to fail, and in the process, she had shattered a record that no man had been able to touch, proving that determination and excellence could overcome any barrier. But more than that, she had opened a door that could never be closed. Future generations of women would know that they too could aspire to serve among America's elite warriors. Sarah had become living proof that the only limits that matter are the ones we place on ourselves. Her story became legend within the SEAL community, not because she was a woman, but because she was an exceptional warrior who happened to be a woman. She had earned her place not through lowered standards or special treatment, but through superior performance and unbreakable will. Years later, when young women asked if they could try for the SEALs, instructors would tell them about Sarah Mitchell, the woman who asked the same question, ignored the laughter, and proved that excellence has no gender. They would tell them about the record that no man could touch, and the warrior who broke it by refusing to accept that anything was impossible. Sarah's legacy wasn't just about breaking barriers. It was about redefining what it meant to be a Navy SEAL in the 21st century.